Hello, it's Mark here from Yokel Bear Reads. I'm going to be doing a 3-book review this time about a very specific genre. Well, I don't know whether it's a genre, but books that are connected by a theme. But to explain this theme, I'm going to take you back to my childhood and something that I absolutely loved when I was a child. I was one of those kids who was really into, I guess you'd call it the paranormal, but mysteries, ghosts, monsters, that kind of thing. And there was one particular mystery, one particular monster that I was really interested in, and that was the Loch Ness Monster. I used to buy loads of these kind of books. Very credulous books, written mainly for kind of young adults and children at the time, about how the monster exists and all the evidence and stuff like that. And look at that cover. That cover's fantastic. That's the actual copy that I bought probably in about 1975, 1976, possibly after that. But I've kept these because they've got enormous sentimental value to me. Another one was The Loch Ness Story by Nicholas Witchell. Now, Nicholas Witchell, some of you might know, is now a famous BBC journalist. But when he was younger, he actually pitched a tent next to Loch Ness to try and find the monster. So good on you, Nicholas. Another little thing about this book is when I picked it up recently, because I haven't picked it up for decades, I found this inside, which is I absolutely love. Hold on, I've got to find it first of all. Where are you? Oh yeah, there it is. This is a newspaper picture that I cut out on the 21st of June 1976. It says the date on the back. There's a picture of scientists looking for the Loch Ness Monster, and I must have cut that out of a paper when I was a child and stored it in the book. And finding that, it was like a real rush of nostalgia. There was also at the time a TV series called Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, presented by Arthur C. Clarke, the sci-fi writer. And I recently got the DVD because I've not watched it since that time when I was young. When I saw this, I bought it because I wanted to see kind of how it stood up and stuff like that. Each episode was a different theme, like you had the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, Bigfoot, that kind of thing, sea serpents. It actually, in some ways, it stood up quite well because it's really engrossing watching. In other ways, you can tell it was a product of its time, which was probably the early 80s, which you can really tell from the hair and the fashion. Believe me, there's some hilarious fashion in here. But yeah, this was the kind of stuff that I was interested in. And I've kept that interest, but I've become much more of a skeptic over the years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I do the book reviews. Because I still like to read books about mysteries, about cryptozoology, as they call it. Hidden animals, mythical animals. This is the stuff that I like to read, but I like to read it from a very critical viewpoint. I don't like reading books where it's all, the starting point of, yeah, we believe. I'd rather a kind of dispassionate look at the evidence and then see where you're at the end. And these 3 books, I think, do this. And I've read these all in the last year or so. The first one is Graham Highlands' Yeti, An Abominable History. Now, I absolutely loved the first 3 quarters of this book. The first 3 quarters of this book I read in probably one sitting, and it's a fairly big book. It's kind of a history of sightings of the Yeti, or the Abominable Snowman, as it's sometimes known. Though the interesting thing about that is it became the Abominable Snowman because when a mountaineer saw what he thought was a Yeti, he asked his native guide, "What's that?" And he translated what the guide said as an abominable snowman, but it would seem that it was a mistranslation, and it was actually what the guide was saying was a dirty man. So it's quite possible the Yeti might have been a vagrant, a hermit, something like that, and not actually some big, great kind of ape-like creature. This book looks at the kind of evidence. It looks at the photographs. It looks at sightings. It also looks at some of the literature that's been produced about the Yeti. It is also about kind of mountaineering culture, because a lot of the book is about the early expeditions to conquer Everest, to conquer various different peaks in the Himalayas. So there's lots of stuff around kind of mountaineering culture, and that's something I'm interested in as well. I really do love a good mountaineering book. It's written in a very chatty style, and there's often some quite wry comments and a few jokes thrown in. There was occasions where I did genuinely chuckle at some of the things that Graham Highland had written. Another great thing about it is it's not only looking at evidence for the Yeti, it goes off on these tangents occasionally, which are kind of related but a little bit to one side, like the lives of famous mountaineers like Eric Shipton, who was a fascinating character because he had a real beef with the mountaineering establishment. And in fact, there's a possibility that he might have faked some Yeti prints to kind of get his own back on the establishment. There's a guy in there called Ralph Izzard, who's another mountaineer that was involved with kind of hunts for the Yeti. But they believe, Graham Highland believes he was actually he was the basis of the villain in Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, Le Chiffre, wasn't it? That this guy, this mountaineer, might have been the basis for him. There's also other little things in there, like how the CIA used Yeti hunting trips as cover to get near to Tibet, to be able to. It was the whole time when the 50s, where the Chinese were threatening to invade, and how they used Yeti expeditions to do reconnaissance to get the Dalai Lama out and stuff like that. So there's lots of really interesting stuff in here. What I didn't like though was the last quarter of the book. The asides just went completely off to a different place. There was a look at the Loch Ness Monster. There was a look at the American Bigfoot, which was probably related, because I think you can't really talk about the Yeti without looking at the Bigfoot sightings. But it also went off onto these tangents about population control, crop circles, the Trump election even, which didn't really seem to hang together. But at the end he did kind of pull it together about it being about the media, it being about stories that aren't necessarily true becoming true, and about kind of that whole post-truth thing, and where Yeti sightings might be an early version of kind of that fake news, and where stuff just gets embedded into the culture because it's just been repeated over and over. All in all, it's a good book. It's worth the read. Like I said, beware of the last quarter, because you do need to kind of dig in. There was a bit towards the end where I was sat there thinking, oh, this has started to get a bit hard going. But it was more than made up for by the first three quarters. I'm definitely going to give this a 4 out of 5. So yeah, it's worth a read. So let's get on to my favourite one. The next book is A Monstrous Commotion, The Mysteries of Loch Ness by Gareth Williams. This is a 5 out of 5 book for me. I just absolutely loved it. Like the previous book, it's kind of a story of sightings of Nessie in chronological order, but it's much, much more than that. It's about the personalities that were involved in the whole phenomena. and a kind of some of the events that happened around the sightings and some of the things that happened away from Loch Ness. Like, for instance, there's the story of a curator from the Natural History Museum who was sacked from his job for believing in the Loch Ness Monster. There's lots of stuff in here about kind of how the scientific establishment has kind of not really followed through on searching for the monster, but there's all kinds of reasons for that. There's lots of really accessible stuff in here about the geology and science of the loch itself, which is really interesting, how Loch Ness was formed, why it's so deep, why it's got so little fish in it, and why it's almost kind of like a dead lake. There's very little life in there. But it's also about how and why people believe in stuff that they don't actually have evidence for, almost like a kind of an updated version of a religious faith. There's some really good bits in here. There's the story of the surgeon's photo, which is the famous photograph of the Loch Ness Monster that if you've seen it, you will absolutely know it. But how it's a fake and how it proved to be a fake. And there's a really fascinating bit of this book which goes through how that fake photo was made and how it fooled the world for so many times and how it fooled a lot of scientists as well. And it also ends, the thing about this book is, what I love is it actually ends by looking at all the possible theories and kind of looking at the pros and cons, presenting the case for and against. Now, his conclusion is interesting, and that's all I'm going to say, apart from maybe one thing. When you reach the conclusion, you look back at the book and think, actually, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And I'm kind of sold on his conclusion, which I'm not going to give it away, but I'm going to give you one clue. There's a name that keeps cropping up all the way through the history of sightings of the monster. I think Gareth Williams has literally written the definitive book on the Loch Ness Monster phenomena. I give it a 5 out of 5. I'd give it a 6 out of 5 if I could, if that was possible. Give it a 10 out of 5 maybe. Absolutely love this book. And if you love reading stuff about mysteries, but also if you like reading about how the media picks up on stories, or why people believe things, or how it's possible to get people to believe things, this is a book for you. I've had a bit of a strange history with the Loch Ness Monster, and I'll tell you about it now actually. As I said, I used to be a firm believer in the Loch Ness Monster, absolutely convinced. But as I grew older, there was a moment of realisation, and that realisation was there can't just be one monster, and that's the problem. It has to be a breeding population of creatures, and for that you'd need probably at least 40, maybe 100 to be a viable breeding population. And certainly if it's a survived plesiosaur, well, they were air breathers, so these 40 to 100 would need to surface every couple of hours, which means we'd see the Loch Ness Monster all the time if there was that big a population. And without that big population, a species isn't going to survive. So there was a moment, and this was I remember at the time being really, really upset. I felt like my childhood had ended because I suddenly realised this can't be real. This can't be real. And this is what I love about the Gareth Williams books. He's actually given a lot of explanations about how some of the famous sightings are actually something else. But that explanation is fascinating in itself. It did feel like my childhood ended. I was upset for weeks. It was like one of the most disappointing things in my childhood was the realisation the Loch Ness Monster didn't exist. But what I did pick up from that was I started reading more about science and being kind of more critical in my thinking. So I think in the long run it did me a lot of good. It's also given me an interest in kind of folklore and stuff like that. Why do people believe things? This is something that fascinates me, is why do people believe things that there is no real tangible evidence for, apart from some blurry photographs and some eyewitness statements. And one thing in these books is it's clear eyewitness statements really aren't reliable. We think we've got a good memory, but most of us don't. And within 20 minutes of us seeing something, we're already starting to misremember things. Okay, so on to the third and final book. Now, it's not really about monsters, so that no big yetis, no great big creatures in lochs, but it's about the other thing that I was really interested in when I was younger. And it is, of course, UFOs. This is How UFOs Conquered the World, the history of a modern myth. And the clue there is in the title. It's about a modern myth. Is why do people believe this? Again, it's very similar in format. It sticks vaguely chronological order of kind of the UFO phenomena through the ages. But its emphasis, again, is not on whether it's real, but it's about why people believe it and why this evidence is enough for some people but not for others. It's also told through the stories of people that have been involved through the decades in investigating the UFO phenomena. And there's some really interesting kind of, you see how the phenomena's changed over time. One thing that was really interesting was in the 1950s, a lot of UFO sightings and so say contact with extraterrestrials was all about them being friendly and coming to us with a message about how we could make our society better and stuff like that. But by the 2000s, it was all about alien probes and being abducted. And it's fascinating. One thing that David Clarke really does is puts it in its sociological context about how these sightings have mirrored what's going on in society. Another interesting thing is about how the shape of UFOs have changed from flying saucers in the 50s to the kind of big triangular shaped ones, but how they've mirrored how films and TV have portrayed flying saucers and UFOs. Like for instance, in the X-Files, they introduced those kind of triangular UFOs, and then all of a sudden there were loads of sighting of triangular UFOs. So this is really about the media as well. It's also about kind of how modern day folklore inserts itself into kind of society and becomes almost like, again, like a religion, like a faith for some people. It's also as well, the last chapter and the conclusion chapter is called In the Eye of the Beholder. And one thing that this really challenges is this whole idea that people who have seen UFOs say about, I know what I saw. About you may have seen something, but it's very unreliable to know exactly what you've seen sometimes because we're flawed, our memories are flawed. All of these books, by the way, I give that a 5 out of 5 as well. This is really good as well. The reason I reviewed these is because I really rate those. There are others that I'm probably not going to review because they're not as good and I only want the best for you. So to sum up, I mean, when I was a child, I was a really credulous believer in everything. Now I'm more discerning. I don't really believe in UFOs. I don't really believe in the Loch. Well, I certainly don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster. But I'm fascinated about reading about it because I think they're not just monsters or aliens and stuff like that. They're sociological and cultural phenomena. They're something that we kind of, seek to interpret something in the world. The other thing is that I think they're just good stories. They're just really good stories. The idea that there's a prehistoric monster in a lake is a good story. And that's why I like them, because I'm a book lover and I love a good story. And I think that's the whole thing, is that we all need stories. We all need stories in our lives. And these are some of the stories that, whilst they're kind of non-fiction, whilst some people would say that they're real, they're essentially a good story. And that's what I love about them. So that's me. That's me about some books I've read, a review of them, and also about how, albeit briefly, the Loch Ness Monster ruined my childhood. So that's the video. Next time I'll be doing a book review. No, I won't actually. I'm going to do a book haul. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a book haul. It's about time I did one. I've not done a book haul on here. Okay, so that's the video. Thank you very much. Bye.